The best way to understand any battlefield really is to walk it. So this morning I'm walking a bit of ground around the Belgian city of Ypres, which is just across to my right. And the road that I'm on now ran parallel to where the front lines were for a good period of the war, from 1915 to 1917, when there were no big battles at Ypres, but there was the day-to-day activities of trench warfare, men just holding the line on both sides of no man's land. And our walk's going to take us across the area where that line was static for so long, up towards positions like Railway Wood and the WW1 Ridge and down to Hooge. And we'll get a bit of an understanding of both the war on the landscape of the Western Front and beneath it as well, with the war underground. But we're starting at some memorials close to where those frontline locations were. We've walked up to a series of memorials here that commemorate two individual soldiers and one regiment that fought here in the battles of 1915. The Second Battle of Ypres in April and May of that year saw the first use of poison gas on the Western Front, and in the latter stages of that battle the fighting revolved around the ridges behind me here. The so-called Frezenberg Ridge, named after the hamlet of Frezenberg, and WW1 Ridge, named after the WW1 farm and the lake that was there on that part of the battlefield. And units of the British Army and Commonwealth forces were forced back by the Germans, pushing towards Ypres and defending this ground. And men from cavalry regiments, so men who normally would fight on horseback, were sent up dismounted, so dismounted from their horses, being used as infantry, basically to come up to the front line and fight. And the losses were very heavy amongst those cavalry regiments. And most of the men who were killed here do not have a known grave. Their names are on the Menin Gate Memorial at Ypres. But what we've got here is some private memorials placed by the families of missing soldiers. And one of those is to Captain Geoffrey Bowlby of the Royal Horse Guards Cavalry Regiments. That he was killed here in May 1915 during the tail end of that Second Battle of Ypres, killed out in the fields behind me here, and his body was never recovered. Now, after the war, it wasn't clear really what would happen to these men who were missing in the Great War. How would they be commemorated? They'd never really been commemorated in previous conflicts. But as this conflict had touched almost every family in Britain, and nearly 50% of the dead were missing on almost every battlefield of the Great War, what to do with these men? And in the case of Captain Bowlby, the family stepped in first. Rather than wait for the British government to erect a memorial, they put up their own one. And it used to be out in the field. I first visited it in the 1980s when it was placed on the spot close to where he had died in 1915. And then some years ago they moved them together near to some other memorials. One to Captain Scrine, who is here. He was killed on the 25th September 1915 when his battalion of the Somerset Light Infantry made an attack across this ground, as a diversionary attack as part of the Battle of Loos that was taking place further in northern France at that time. And his body was never recovered. His name is on the Menin Gate, but his family placed a memorial to him here as well. And that was joined by a memorial to the Leicestershire Yeomanry, a territorial army, territorial force as it was then, cavalry regiment that also served here alongside the regular units of Britain's cavalry regiments during that key moment of the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. So this is where this front was kind of established at the tail end of the tail end of the fighting of the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. And then it remained static for the next 2 years, from that end of Second Ypres through to the beginning of the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917. One of the great things about walking the battlefields is that you really get an appreciation of the landscape. And I think my 40 years of walking the Western Front, landscape has really been an important part of it. To understand the history of the Great War, you have to understand more than just what in the books and the war diaries and the individual accounts of soldiers who were here. You have to understand the landscape as it was then and the landscape as it is today. And walking it like this is a great way to really appreciate that. Off the beaten track here in Flanders, you can be alone in this landscape. Never quite alone, I don't think, because the ghosts of the First World War, I really do feel, still walk alongside us in many ways. But what you do find is that you can have this battlefield to yourself almost, and you can explore it and understand it, and I think that's really an important part of visiting places like this. The modern world encroaches on it slightly because we're about to cross the busy road that once was the railway line, but nevertheless, really, the century since the Great War doesn't really feel that far away when you walk the ground like this.